to our fourth lecture in human tissues. In this episode of histology, the study of tissues, we're going to be focusing on membranes. When it comes to membranes can be classified as one of our four types of tissues, right? So remember, we have connective tissue, muscular tissue, epithelial tissue, and nervous tissue. Membranes help form barriers and create linings and boundaries in the body, so we are still in epithelial tissue. So let's talk about membranes. Membranes are flat sheets of pliable tissue that cover or line a part of the body. It's the combination of an epithelial layer and the underlying connective tissue layer that is going to constitute an epithelial membrane. So cutaneous, you should think of skin. Like a subcutaneous injection is an injection underneath the skin. The skin is your largest organ, and it's the largest membrane in your body. Your skin or cutaneous membrane, which forms a barrier between the external environment and the inside of your body, is a stratified squamous epithelium in the outermost layer known as the epidermis. That epidermis sits on top of a layer of connective tissue that is known as the dermis. And it's a relatively dry layer, and since it's made out of many layers of a squamous epithelium, it is going to function for protection. We're going to talk a lot about this cutaneous membrane in Unit 3. Mucous membranes are wet or moist membranes that line body cavities, opening to the exterior part of the body. So you got to be careful here, because if you think about like the lungs, there's one layer that is lining the part of the lungs that are open to the external environment. And then there's another layer on the other side that lines to the body cavities. Lining of the body cavity is not what we're talking about here, right? We are looking at the portion that opens to the external environment or the air that we breathe in. Same thing with the digestive tract. When we swallow our food, it's going to go through a long tube. And that long tube is a mucous membrane. And we're going to talk about the mucosa that lines this mucous membrane a lot in 202. So in 202, every single organ that we talk about, we look at the histology of it and we find the sublayers. We will find the simple cuboidal epithelial tissue, or I'm sorry, the simple columnar epithelial tissue, or we'll look at the pseudostratified epithelial tissue. And then there'll be a layer that's deep to that called the lamina propria, which is a type of connective tissue we'll learn about in this unit called areolar connective tissue. And then there's going to be a muscular layer. And typically that muscular layer in most instances will be a smooth muscle, which we'll learn all about smooth muscle in this unit as well. So that is called the muscularis mucosa layer. And when we're looking at this mucous membrane that's lining the passages, we're going to find those goblet cells that secrete the mucus. So that way it can capture particles and substances that are trying to get into the body that we don't necessarily want to get into the body. Look at this mucous membrane under the microscope. We're going to first look at the top layer of cells that's by the apical surface, right? So we still have the apical surface, which is this free surface over here. And so that free surface of the mucous membrane is going to be lined with a simple columnar epithelium, or like in this example, it's a pseudostratified epithelium. And then there's going to be that basement membrane, which acts like the glue holding it to the layer down below, which is going to be a connective tissue. This connective tissue is going to have all the blood vessels and fibers running through it and acting like a support system for that epithelial tissue up above. And then deep in the mucous membrane, we're going to find a layer of smooth muscle. Right, so the epithelium lasts from like that cilia and where we see this mucus coat, since there will be goblet cells secreting this mucus. We'll see a layer of cilia, and that epithelium is going to go down to that basement membrane. The lamina propria will extend from the basement membrane to the muscularis layer. And then the muscularis layer is its own section. So there's three major sections of this mucous membrane or mucosa. Serous membranes are moist membranes that do not open directly to the exterior, and they cover the organs that line within the body cavities. So this is the area or the membrane we have that's on the other side that is lining the body cavities. So it's an internal lining. These serous membranes will secrete a watery, lubricating fluid called a serous fluid. And that serous fluid will create a frictionless environment that allows the organs to glide easily over one another or slide against the walls of the cavities. This is a simple squamous epithelium that is called the mesothelium. And it will rest on top of a layer of connective tissue that's called areolar connective tissue. So examples are the pleura of the lungs, the membranes that surround the heart called the pericardium, and then the layer that goes around the intestines and the visceral organs in the abdominal cavity called the peritoneum. These serous membranes consist of two parts. There is a parietal layer that is attached to the cavity wall, and there is a visceral layer that covers and attaches to the organ within the body cavity. In the lungs, if we look at the portion of the lungs that's inside of the thoracic cavity, right, that thoracic cavity can be subdivided in the lateral portions that hold the lungs are called the pleural cavities. And so there is a membrane that surrounds those lungs within this pleural cavity. And there are two layers to this pleura. There is the parietal pleura that is going to line the body cavity and make contact with the pleural cavity. And then there is the visceral pleura that is actually touching the lungs themselves. And then the space between is going to fill up with that serous fluid that these cells are creating. So every time you breathe in and exhale, these lungs can expand and collapse without friction, and they can easily glide within the pleural cavity. The serous membrane lining the heart and covering the heart is the same way. It's called the pericardium, right? Para means around, cardia is heart. So this is a serous membrane that will line the abdominal cavity. It will line the pericardium and line the heart. So the visceral pericardium is the portion of this serous membrane that actually touches the heart. And the parietal pericardium will be the portion of the serous membrane that lines the pericardial cavity. And in between will be that serous fluid. The serous membrane that lines the abdominal cavity and covers all of those abdominal organs is the peritoneum. And that too will have two layers. It will have a visceral peritoneum that's actually touching all of those abdominal organs. And then there'll be the parietal peritoneum that is making contact with the abdominal wall. And this membrane is going to hold all of the organs in place. So that way all of our organs aren't just moving around in the abdominal cavity. They are anchored in place. My brain works in flowcharts. So when we're looking at these membranes, we can classify them as two types. They're either an epithelial membrane, where we have the serous, mucous, and cutaneous. And then there are synovial membranes, which we're going to find in our joints. So the synovial membranes will line the joints and they contain connective tissue, but this type does not contain any epithelial tissue. All right, so here we have a cross section of a normal knee joint, and you can see the patella, which is the kneecap. And then you have your femur, which is your thigh bone, meeting with your tibia, which is like your shin bone. And there is a membrane that's going to line this joint. And so you can see that's in blue here. And so that synovial membrane is made out of connective tissue, and there will be a synovial fluid inside of it, but there's no epithelial tissue. That synovial fluid that the synovial membranes secrete will lubricate the ends of the bones as they move at joints. And that synovial fluid will also nourish what's called articular cartilage that we find lining the bone where bone meets with another bone. Circling back to these mucous membranes that have those goblet cells, I just want to talk about the goblet cells a little bit more. So goblet cells are glandular, simple columnar epithelial cells, and their sole function is to make mucus. They are mucus making machines. So this mucus will trap particles. So we're going to find this in places where there is exposure to the external environment, like our eyes, our nose, our mouth, lining our trachea, the gastrointestinal tract, and the anus. We're going to find goblet cells in all of these areas. And those goblet cells will release the mucus, which traps particles. So the mucus can be moved along the surface of the epithelium by cilia. Cilia are those little hair-like projections, and they move to a beat. And it's this organized beating of the cilia that can move the mucus along the surface. So for example, in the trachea, where we have a pseudostratified columnar epithelium with those mucus cells, if there is dust, debris, pollution that we're breathing in, those particles can get captured by the mucus. And then the cilia will beat, and instead of that particle going further into our lungs, it will start to beat up and move up out of our lungs. And then we can hawk up a nice little loogie and spit it out and get it out of our body. So here I have a great histology image of a simple columnar epithelium, so in our gastrointestinal tract. You can definitely see that it is a simple columnar epithelium. I have those nuclei lined up, You can imagine those cell membranes. You can even see the brush border that's made up of that cilia. And here I've got those goblet cells, right? So here I have a goblet cell. Here's a goblet cell. Here's a goblet cell. Here's another goblet cell. If I want you to identify a goblet cell, though, I'm going to point to the droplet of mucus, right? This guy right here. And if we look over on the left side, you can really see that goblet cell actively secreting that mucus into the lumen or opening there, that empty space. So associate the goblet cells with mucus secretion, right? And we're going to find them in places where we are trying to capture things and prevent them from getting into the body, like the trachea or the large and small intestines. We only want nutrients to get absorbed and not bad things. Or the conjunctiva, which is like your upper eyelid. So if you've ever woken up one morning and you got some extra crusty eye boogers and you got to like pick them out, that's why it's these goblet cells in the conjunctiva of your eyelid that are secreting some extra mucus. And if you ever have had pink eye or conjunctivitis, that's an inflammation of the epithelium that makes up the conjunctiva. When those tissues are irritated and inflamed, those mucus cells are going to secrete extra mucus and they're going to try to get whatever is causing that irritation out of your eye. Back to this image, when we're looking at a simple columnar epithelium, if I needed you to identify things on a slide like this, what I would want you to do is first try to identify the cells to figure out how many layers we have here. Right, so you got your free surface, which is here, right? That's the apical surface. And then your basement membrane is here. So that's the basement membrane, and I hope you can see a nice line between these cells and this spacey connective tissue down below. And then you can see the columnar cells, so you can see those cell membranes, and these are definitely nice column-shaped cells. And then you got the goblet cells here, and he's secreting mucus. But if I ever asked you to identify a goblet cell, I would point right to that mucus droplet and say, what is that? And you could tell me it's a goblet cell. When you chime in, we will talk about connective tissues.